Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming by today. Looks like we're getting a little better break in the weather than we have. You'll see there the cover of the book that came out about a year ago that I wrote. And it came about, frankly, because having been schooled in New Jersey up to and including my master's degree up at Montclair State, no one of those instructors over any of those years ever mentioned that there was such a thing as slavery in New Jersey. So 5 or 8 years ago, when I started doing research into other parts of our history, I kept stumbling over these stories. And at one point, I had accumulated enough material to put this book out. And part of the purpose of the book, frankly, is to educate all of us to a reality that I think reflects what we're dealing with today as a society. We'll get right into it. There's the cover of the book, and we'll talk about a couple of things. First thing I want you to remember, or maybe you didn't know, is that way back after the European colonists came in the 17th century, our state, not quite a state then, was divided in two parts: East Jersey, where we all are, and then West Jersey. And through the centuries, obviously, we've been united as first a province, then a colony, then a state. But things back then were quite different. And so I think this quote's quite appropriate for us to keep in mind, especially with the topic that we're going to speak about today. These are not pleasant events and stories, but you'll see as we go through, I think, that people thought quite differently than we do today. So that said, as a preface, we'll get into a couple of things. I think you have all seen this painting thousands of times, probably from kindergarten, first grade, whenever. And it's a historic, although an apocryphal painting, since it was done almost 75 years after the actual event. And of course, it portrays George Washington and the men crossing the Delaware at McConkey's Ferry in Pennsylvania over to the New Jersey side here, Christmas Eve, 1776. And they're about to engage the British down in Trenton. And of course, we've all been taught that they were fighting for the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But the question that we're going to pose today is, that's wonderful, but whose? And I don't know if you've ever noticed, and I certainly didn't until very recently, that right in front of our commander-in-chief, later president, is a Black man. And that person is actually, the painter must have known something about George Washington in those days, because it's based on a historic figure, which we'll talk about a little later. But again, the premise here is that no matter what we were taught as young people in school, when you dig under the covers of history, so-called, you'll find that the motivations for these people were sometimes different than we've been led to believe. So when did and where did slavery begin in New Jersey? It actually began with these men, who you can probably tell from the outfit are Dutchmen. And up in New York, what they called at the time New Amsterdam, and this whole territory of New York and New Jersey and even into Delaware was referred to as New Netherland. The Dutch took over pretty early in the 17th century at a place called Bergen Neck. Now, you can see in a more contemporary map that it's here, which is where the Dutch started, okay? The now Hudson River, they call the North River. And here, in this neck of land, so-called, which is now Jersey City and Bayonne, some of you may know that area, is where it began. And it began because the Dutch West India Company, in order to encourage Dutch colonists to settle this land, were offering slaves to them so they could farm what was then a barren land, except for, of course, Native Americans. So they did that successfully. And they started to bring in slaves from South America and the Caribbean, which had come originally, of course, from Africa, into New York, and then what became New Jersey very early on. And so that is where slavery got a foothold, if you will, in our state. Now, the English take over in about 1664. And at that time, the Dutch had established right here in Jersey City a little village of Bergen, which ironically to me, as I found out later, was about 2 blocks from where I went to college at St. Peter's in Jersey City. That was the original colony of Dutch. And then they, again, populated all this with farms powered by slave labor. When the English took over, these guys, who I'm sure you know, Berkeley and Carteret, were given the same land that the Dutch had formerly occupied. And in what is considered the one of the founding documents of New Jersey that they issued is called the Concession and Agreement of the Lords Proprietor. They gave to any white English colonist who would come over to their land and basically what became New Jersey, 150 acres per white settler, a husband and a wife, for example, and their children. And then for each additional slave they brought in, they were given an additional 75 acres. So what we have in effect is that slavery is baked into the founding documents of New Jersey. And the question is, well, why would they do that? And the reason is because their patron, this guy, the Duke of York, who gave them this territory after they took over from the Dutch, had several years before founded a company called the Royal African Company. And its charter enables the shipping from Great Britain to England to go down the coast of Africa and bargain for, you can see here, 2 black people, but to bargain for slaves. And they would bring down European produced goods, finished goods, pots and pans and plates and all this, trade them for human beings. And the Duke of York was encouraging these 2 proprietors of the colony, as well as others, to buy through his company slaves. And so, because they had been given the land, they were grateful to do this. You can also see, by the way, here an elephant on their corporate seal. So this is how the English just kind of ratcheted up from what the Dutch had already started. And it begins this long, shameful history of importing Africans, either directly from Africa eventually, or from the South American and Caribbean holdings that the Europeans had. Now, among those holdings was Barbados, way down almost to South America. And you see here a very famous image of, believe it or not, Quaker planters, in this case, tobacco planters in Barbados, with slaves in the background who were doing all the work. And Barbados became basically the model for slavery in New Jersey, because soon thereafter they took over here. Some Barbadian planters, mostly sugar planters, by the way, which is another cash crop, came up to Monmouth County, which included, by the way, at that time, what is now York County, Ocean County. And early in the 1670s, up here, closer to me, in a place called Tinton Falls, these Barbadian planters come up with their slaves. So now you have slavery established firmly in what was then Bergen County, now Hudson County, up in North Jersey, and then down here in more or less Central Jersey. So it began and it grew very, very rapidly. Now at Tinton Falls, where it took off here in, again, Monmouth County, it was initiated by a man called Lewis Morris, who, as you see, was a Quaker. And around that year, 1676, he brings 60 or 70 of his sugar plantation slaves up here, including, we know quite a lot about, a personal servant, AKA a slave named Yap. Now, here's a contemporary map of, and if any of you know the Tinton Falls area, it's still a little village here along the Pine Brook Creek. And Lewis Morris starts his manor here, what he calls a manor, gets permission from the Lords Proprietors to open up this iron mill. And it's not an iron mill like you think about with pick and shovel and all that. It's what's called bog iron. They're mining iron minerals from the decayed vegetation along the stream beds here. And he establishes all of these homes for his workers, including his black slaves. In fact, right there on that map, which on an aerial view today is this, here's Tinton Falls. This happens to be Tinton Falls Road. This is Sycamore Avenue, if you know that geography at all. And right here, you can't see it with the vegetation, is the Pine Brook. But right about here is where archaeologists believe is a slave burial ground. Obviously, when he brought up these men and women, when they were either worked to death or died of natural causes, they had to be buried somewhere. So we think, archaeologists who've examined this particular site, believe that right here is probably the earliest burial ground for African-American slaves in Monmouth County. Now he's there, Lewis Morris, for a specific reason. At one point, these falls, the Tinton Falls, after which the town is named, were about 20 foot high. And they needed those falls to turn the wheels, because not only was he making bog iron in furnaces, he was also planting corn and rice. No, I shouldn't say rice, I should say wheat and barley and other crops. And he needed the slaves to grind that into flour that he could sell into the New York market. So pretty quickly, the slavery population, not only in Tinton Falls, but throughout Monmouth County, grows as more people understand that they can, if they have enough money, purchase slaves and use them to do all the heavy lifting of agricultural work, which is how our state is based. So it goes on, and he dies, Lewis Morris, in around 1690, 1691. And in his last will, right before he dies, he writes a couple things. And this is going to startle you, I think, as it did me. One of the items in this multi-page will he gives is, I give and bequeath unto my honored friend, William Penn, my Negro man, Yaf, provided said yen shall come back to dwell in America. Yes, that William Penn. Now, the backstory is William Penn, after he started the Pennsylvania colony and founded Philadelphia, went back to London. He was a businessman. And he was a friend of Lewis Morris, family friends, actually. So in order to encourage his friend Penn back, he gives him, he calls him his Negro man, but as a slave, is an incentive. And Penn, sure enough, comes back in 1699 and is given possession of this slave by the nephew of Lewis Morris. So of all the things to find out is that who we all think of as this revered kind of Quaker, friendly to the Indians, and all the stories we told. In fact, William Penn also owned slaves. Now, it gets a little bit worse when you look at the multiple pages of Lewis Morris's will. In those days, after somebody died, 3 men usually would come in and take an inventory of their property to settle the debts, et cetera, et cetera. And way down at the end of these pages and pages of inventory, after carts and ships and all kinds of things, is this. Now, those are slaves, and rarely do you see the word slaves in these early colonial documents. They're always referred to as Negroes. And here he values in his, or the inventory values, the amount of slaves he has. And you'll see that the men are worth about 20 pounds then, colonial pounds, women a little bit less, reflecting that men are able to do more and enforce hard work. Women do more domestic chores, etc., all the way down, boys, girls, and children under 5, right? And those 66 enslaved people in Lewis Morris's will represented quite a lot of money. In fact, if you do the numbers today, Yaf would have been, as one of those men, valued at almost $55,000. And the entirety of the slave population when Lewis Morris dies is worth almost $2.4 million in today's currency. He's fabulously wealthy. And this is only part of his estate, but the human beings are worth more than almost anything else. Okay? In fact, his 66 enslaved people at his death represented almost 60% of all of the enslaved people then living in, as I mentioned before, East Jersey, which is where we are. So he's not only fabulously wealthy, he's influential, because the other people that are starting to colonize New Jersey are saying to themselves, basically, well, if rich people can afford slaves, I'm going to try to save my money up. And if I can afford a slave, that's going to make my life easier. And it takes off everywhere because it's blessed by rich and famous people. It's encouraged by the royal government in England, and it's assumed to be normal. William Penn, interesting guy in his own right. There's a very early picture of him. He, as you already know, founded Philly. He bought, you may not know, at one point with other men, first West Jersey and then East Jersey. So in effect, he owned all of what became New Jersey at one point. And it was separated into 2 parts. In the 1680s, as a matter of fact, before he left, he gave orders to his secretary to conduct and to build basically a vacation home, a country home up north of here's Philly, and right around here. You can still visit, by the way, Pennsbury Manor, he had some slaves working on that project while he was back in London. When he comes back from England in 1699, the first future royal governor of New Jersey, same name as the previously mentioned Lewis Morris, gives this personal servant slave Yaff to William Penn. And he then takes Yaff back to London with him a couple years later. So Yaff spends 4 years with Penn. And finally, in England in 1703, we have a copy of a letter from Penn writing back to his secretary here in Philly that after faithful service, he's going to release Yaff. Kind of an amazing story. I was going to go to England a couple years ago before the pandemic to go search to see if I could find any trace of what happened to Yaff after he's freed. As you might suspect, and I do certainly, I don't think he had come back here, even though William Penn in his letter says, hey, I'll book his passage back to America if he wants, because he was a slave. Why would he come back to a place that he had been enslaved for many, many years? Unless, of course, he had family, but we don't have record of that yet. So perhaps we'll find out more about him. But it's kind of amazing when we think about what we know about one individual African. We believe that Yaff had been born in what's now called Senegambia down here on the western coast of Africa. Somehow, as a young boy, got transported to Barbados, worked for Lewis Morris for about 20 years, came up to Tinton Falls, got sent to William Penn when he arrives back in Philadelphia, and then is taken to London with Penn in 1703 when we kind of lose trace of him. Just an amazing journey for a man. Here's that letter I referred to. And in fact, Yaff says to his secretary, James Logan, I've resolved after 4 years of faithful service that I'll set Yaff free and I'll pay for him if he wants to go back. So we'll see if I ever get over to London when this is all over to find out if there's any trace of the man. It would be a fascinating story, I think. So with that said, that's couple of famous men. Slavery, as I mentioned, takes off. So here's a very early 1737 census of New Jersey. You'll see here on the left side, the whites are listed. There's about 44,000 white people living in New Jersey. And under these columns, Negroes and other slaves are about 4,000. So the first question is, who are these other slaves? And as you might suspect, they were Native Americans, mostly Lenape Indians who were native to this part of the world. The ones who were still alive after most had been decimated, probably 90% by European diseases to which they had no resistance. There's about 4,000 slaves in the colony. And that represents about 8% of the total population of New Jersey very early on in our existence. But when you look at Monmouth County, which, as I mentioned, includes today's Ocean County, where you all are, presumably, that number jumps dramatically. And it's a reflection of the colonists that are coming into Ocean and Monmouth, if you think of it that way, rapidly acquiring slaves to farm all this land. Okay, we're exceeded only actually by Bergen County up north, where it all began with the Dutch. And these numbers scare the white slaveholders in ways that you might not expect. You would think, well, it's good. They're getting more slaves, both by buying them and also by natural birth. And we know how that happens, right? Slaveholders knew very well that if they impregnated their female slaves, they could increase their population. But when the numbers start to get this high, they get worried about slave rebellions, because slaves were resisting and rebelling all the time, both individually and in groups. And it scared the white population. And what that causes New Jersey's legislature to do in the early days is to create a series of very harsh slave laws, which we'll talk about. So let's talk about Lewis Morris. This is the nephew, Lewis Morris, same name as the guy who brought the slaves from Barbados. He's the heir. He's also a Quaker early in his life. He is, by default, when he inherits this huge estate of 6,400 acres, the largest landholder and slaveholder in East Jersey. But because he gets resistance from the early abolitionist movement that's starting to heat up among Quakers, he leaves the Friends, Society of Friends, the Quakers, and he founds Christ Episcopal Church, because Christ Church, actually the English church at the time, was more receptive and accepting of slavery. So he founds a church and basically switches religions because it's easier on him. He later becomes the first royal colonial governor. He's a politician too, of New Jersey in 1738. And he goes to a place called Trentstown for his seat of his government. And you know it, and I know it, today is Trenton. And this house here, in this very early image, he rents. It was a house that actually a guy named William Trent had built. William Trent is dead at that point. He rents that house, and that house is still there. It's called the Trent House Museum. And I've spoken there, and you can go there and see the remnants of not only Lewis Morris and his wife, but also the slaves that they brought with them to what became Trenton, our state capital, from Tinton Falls. So you're seeing now that slavery is spreading everywhere early in our history. In fact, a few years ago, I went to a dig that they were doing on the front lawn here because they're looking for a kitchen that Lewis Morris had built, an outbuilding where he not only housed his slaves, but where they did all the work for him and his wife and his family while he was in Trenton for 6 years until he dies. And if we're lucky someday, if they can determine that this is the foundation of that kitchen, which is long gone, they might find artifacts from the slaves who worked there, and it'll tell us a lot more about their individual histories. So a lot to be discovered. Up the road a piece, slavery gets a foothold in slavery through the Stockton family that I know you all know, at least in general, because William Penn, once again, sells a huge part of that parcel that he owned in West Jersey to Richard Stockton. Richard Stockton creates his family fortune on the backs of slaves very early in the 18th century. And in a later map of Princeton, where I'm sure a lot of you have been, his son John starts Princeton University, and his grandson, pictured here, named after him, Richard Stockton, founds what is called Morven, which is here. And they have a wonderful slavery exhibit because that museum group has established a lot of records and are very open about the number of slaves that worked at Morven, which was even at one point the seat of our state government. Now, some very interesting things happened with this Richard Stockton during the Revolutionary War times that he lived. First of all, he's a signer of the Declaration of Independence, notable enough, but I think you probably know, but maybe did not know this number, 41 of the original 56 signers of that document were slaveholders. Pretty startling. During the war against the British, Richard Stockton does something amazing, as does his wife, Annis Boudinot, who's a French descendant, of course. Indeed, Richard Stockton gets captured by the British and comes out of captivity after a couple of years. His health is broken. He dies in 1781. Right before that, his wife, who had their young children, was nursing her own children, and one of her slave women dies. And she wet nursed Marcus Marsh, that woman's son, who stayed with her for the rest of her life after Richard Stockton dies in 1781, and later frees him. So we have this contradiction of slaveholders, they both are slaveholders, who perform, in her case, this really remarkable act of kindness to help raise somebody. And that's very common in our history. It's not all black and white as we might think. Slaveholders occasionally, not all, of course, did these kinds of interventions, if you will, treating people as human beings, even though they didn't believe fundamentally that they were fully embraced human beings. When he died, his wife inherited all the slaves and begins to manumit not only Marcus Marsh, but other slaves during her life. And yet, in 1790, in an early tax document, what do we find? After all of this, here's Annis Stockton, who, as late as 1790, at the end of her life, still owns a slave. So after all of this, she could not see her way clear to free everyone because these people relied on slave labor for their very well-being as well as their economic advancement. And we see that everywhere in the early records of New Jersey and frankly, all the other colonies. Let's get back to George Washington, okay? in the background of this very famous image, frankly, is this guy. That guy is actually the man who we think might have influenced the painting I showed you earlier. And he was a real person. His name was William Billy Lee, who was the personal slave of George Washington all through the Revolution. And you can see here, one of his duties was to set up this battle tent as George Washington fought during the Revolutionary War. Most of those battles, I think, were in New Jersey. He did his meals, he sent messages back and forth, as you can see, took care of his horse, and they were very close. George had bought him right before the war for 61 colonial pounds. Well, what does that mean? That's a huge sum of money, because around that time, you could have bought 8 horses for that, or 13 cows, or if you were a shipwright or a blacksmith or a carpenter, it'd take you the better part of 2 years to earn that kind of money. So slaves were expensive. Gives you an idea of the value of slaves to early colonial white slaveholders, including the founder of our country. Now, it turns out that Lee spent the entirety of the war with George Washington, and then after the war, he retires with Washington to Mount Vernon down in Virginia. And he had met a Black woman named Margaret Thomas, and he went to George Washington and said, "Can we bring her down to Mount Vernon because I want to marry her?" And instead of immediately saying yes, as kind of valuing all of Billy Lee's service, Washington hesitated. He had to think it over. In fact, the people at Mount Vernon say there's no record she ever showed up. So she may have died before he ever married her, or certainly she doesn't show up in the records. But it's an amazing testimony to how George Washington would even hesitate for a second to not grant the very, very human, basic need of a man to bring a wife with him. By the way, in another apocryphal image of George Washington, you can see the Mount Vernon in the background. These slaves that he owned look well-fed, nourished, and happy. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, as a matter of fact, we know by the records that George Washington, kind of startling, right? 317 slaves at that plantation when he died. And of that group, in his will, he only frees one. And that is, again, here's another image in the background of Billy Lee. Here he is in Mount Vernon with Martha Washington, of course. And these are the children he adopted. They're actually her grandchildren from her first marriage. What's that about? Well, she was married to Daniel Custis, who died, and brought 84 slaves from her first marriage into the marriage. So of this total, even if he had wanted to, George Washington, under laws in those days, could not have freed what were called dower slaves. It was her dowry. And he was powerless to do it. But of the other couple of hundred, he only decided in his will to free Billy Lee, who was an old man at the time. And she was no charmer either, because she, in her will, of the rest of the slaves that she inherited, only freed one. It's kind of remarkable to think about these people who, although they were just like other people, didn't see that they were dealing with real human beings who deserved their own freedoms. In fact, she was a little bit more vicious than you might suspect. Here's an early painting of her, probably in her first marriage. And look at the statement. She expects gratitude for kindnesses that she showed to her slaves. And the question has to be, what kindnesses? I mean, her slaves were running away, by the way, any chance they got, including a very famous woman who ran away, and they searched for her for years. Luckily, never caught her. But to imagine that slaves who you control every living, breathing moment of their lives would show gratitude is just amazing. But this was very common in the way people thought of their enslaved human beings in those days. Not just rich people like the Washingtons and other founding members of our country, but average slaveholders. It's not to say that some slaveholders weren't kind, but the vast majority did not treat slaves as human beings. In fact, it gets a little bit worse when you look at New Jersey, because there were, in the early history of our country, over 24 men, all men in those days, in Congress that we had elected that were slaveholders at one point in their life. Again, you sort of vaguely know this as I did, but when you look at the numbers, it's really, really surprising. I'm going to fast forward here to see what happens. As you already can see and know from history, slavery takes hold, not just in the South, which everybody commonly thinks of. And, we were inundated with Gone with the Wind and other stories when we were kids, but it's everywhere. In all the original colonies, there are huge numbers of slaves because it's largely agricultural. As a matter of fact, by 1850, the Southern slaveholders are depending so much upon slave labor for cotton, tobacco, and rice that they demand and get through Congress a law called the Fugitive Slave Act. And it's harsh because it says that anybody who shelters or helps an escaped slave up north, especially up here in New Jersey and elsewhere, is subject to arrest and fine. And oh, by the way, these Southern planters, because they're worried about, and it's literally hundreds and thousands of slaves that are running away when they get the chance, that they have to get their slaves back. So slave catchers they hire to go up, and these men, if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave as an example, are notorious for capturing any Black person, enslaved or free, they can get their hands on, and bringing them back south and selling them. And this creates alarm up here in the slave holding, even though we were slave holding in our original days, we still have a number of slave holders or people sympathetic to the slave holding cause. And you see a series of newspaper ads throughout the North about, hey, be careful, okay? The slave laws now are enacted and people are coming up here. Protect yourself if you're a white person protecting slaves or helping them, and protect those people because they're subject to arrest and you're subject to penalty of law if you help them. And it creates this awful atmosphere for years where these basically vigilantes come up, take Black people off the street, hunt them down because they get rewarded. So it's an ugly part of our history, and it certainly builds up the tension and the heat to what becomes the Civil War, as you would expect. How did we in New Jersey approach abolition? Because, as I mentioned, although early Quakers were not abolitionists, they certainly by the middle of the 18th century became abolitionists and led that fight. But how did New Jersey itself approach abolition as a whole? And here's the answer. It took us a long time, the better part of 200 years as a state legislatively to come to grips with this awful practice. As I mentioned, we increasingly created more laws to create harsh conditions for slaves, to regulate them because of fear that they would run away or basically kill white slaveholders, which they were apt to do. In fact, one of the earliest laws says that if you want to free your slaves, you've got to provide 200 pounds to the government and then another 20 pounds every year for life. This is a huge amount of money. And it's put into that law specifically because the people that make the law know nobody's going to be able to do that. And so even though they're kind of nodding toward, yeah, we know slavery is not a good thing, you might want to free them, at the same time, they're making it virtually impossible. It was so unpopular that they repealed the law. This law is notorious. In 1804, New Jersey passes what's called the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Gradual being the instructive word there, because that law says that any women who have, slave women who have children after July 4th that year, the children are free, except if they're female children, they have to serve 21 years, as it says servants, but basically slaves from that master of that woman. And if they're men, boy slaves, they have to serve for 25 years. So it hardly matters to a slave that you call them a servant by law. They're still your property in this law. It also mandates the law, and the good news for us these days is that they have to go down, slaveholders, to their county courthouse and register their slaves. And every courthouse in New Jersey that was in existence then has these records. Here's one from Monmouth County, where in this case, John B. Crawford says that a Negro slave named Nancy had herself a female child named Rose on the 13th day of 1808. And the reason they have to do that is because 21 years later, there should be a corresponding record by Crawford that he freed Rose by law. And sometimes we see that and sometimes we don't. We don't know why. Was Rose dead? Was Rose married and went somewhere else? Was Rose sold? Sometimes we have both records, sometimes we don't. But at least the records are all preserved. Now, in 1844, New Jersey has fewer and fewer slaves because they're being manumitted under this law. And they say in one of our early constitutions, all men are free and independent. But the remaining slaveholders and the businessmen who have interest in selling goods to the Southern slaveholders, and therefore are sympathetic to slavery, take this Constitution to court, and a year later, our Supreme Court says, oh, we really only meant white men. We didn't mean slaves, we didn't mean black people, and we didn't mean women. A couple years later, New Jersey passes another law that says, hey, we finally get it, we're going to abolish slavery. We're really serious this time. But what the law says actually is that current slaves, how many there were, however many there were, have to be apprentices for life. So it's just changing the language of slaves. It's not changing the condition. The good news is that this law is creating more and more free black people by law. And so by the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860, on the last federal census, there are only 18 slaves listed in all of New Jersey. But it's actually not true because there are still many apprentices. They're slaves in practice, but not in name, so they don't appear on the census records. So we don't know, but there's probably several hundred still in New Jersey. So what eventually happens here? Okay. You may not know that New Jersey was the only northern state to vote against President Lincoln in both of our presidential elections. Okay, all the electors that we voted into office did not choose Abraham Lincoln, because again, by the start of the Civil War, in a place like Paterson, where shoe factories were contributing a huge amount to our economy, they were selling these shoes to slaveholders for the slaves in the southern states. So they were not in favor of manumitting slaves. And because Lincoln had made that an increasingly a part of his platform, they didn't vote. As a state, we did not vote for him. Now, you know what happens, right? In 1860, he gets inaugurated. Quickly thereafter, because of his platform, South Carolina secedes, and we have this horrible civil war fought over slavery, no matter what we were taught. It's disguised as states' rights, as economic, independence, and all these kinds of things, but it's over slavery. In 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. However, all that really does is free the slaves in the states of rebellion, because he did not have the power to free any what was deemed personal property slaves that remained in the North. 1865, the war is over finally. Lincoln gets assassinated in April that year. And then soon thereafter, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery forever in the United States. It's ratified by 27 states, the 3/4 that were needed at the time. But embarrassingly, we were the last northern state to go along. At that point, it had been a fait accompli. It was going to happen. And our legislators dragged their feet for another month after it was already done, and finally said, basically, okay, we'll go along with it. That's how entrenched slavery was for 200 years in New Jersey's history. Now, it took another 150 years for our legislature to pass a proclamation of apology, in which we say, oh, we're really sorry for slavery and what we did. We've recognized it wasn't a good thing. And this is just an excerpt. And as good as that is, as a start, there's something missing in this 2008 document. And what's missing is there's no mention of any reparations, which I know you've all heard a lot about lately. And what's ironic about that is that we have a lot of precedent for reparations in this country. We have given reparations to Native Americans in land and money for the land that we took from them and treaties we did not honor. We gave monetary reparations to the Japanese who were interned during World War II, but we have not seen our way fit yet to give reparations to the descendants of enslaved people. The 40 acres and a mule phrase that you've heard was promised by General Sherman to slaves that were freed down south, but it never happened. And we had that horrible period of Jim Crow, which lasted into the 20th century. And people today, as you well know, still resist the idea of repairing, giving any reward or benefit to the descendants of slaves. So this will be a very heated debate that will come up in the rest of our lives, and hopefully something will happen. Because you can easily see, perhaps, that the descendants of slaves have been discriminated against in property and generational wealth by not being able to do the things that a lot of other people have been able to do over the last century and a half. So no matter what your thought is, we look to example, for instance, at the Princeton Theological Seminary, which has now granted scholarships to the descendants of some of the people they enslaved. Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. did the same thing. So you're starting to see this movement toward some kind of reparation, and eventually we might see the people who can prove descendancy from enslaved Africans in this country get monetary rewards, or at least other ways to bring them back into the social mainstream when it comes to their financial well-being. To be determined. So with that, and you've been very kind, you didn't interrupt yet, but I hope you will now. If you'd like, besides being able to read this book that I wrote and take it out of the library by you, if you'd like, you can send me an email, rickg, that's 0817 at Yahoo, and I'll tell you how you can get a signed and dedicated copy directly from me, or any other questions that you might want to ask me about today's talk. But with that said, thank you, and I'll open it up, Allison, to and Cassie, to anybody's questions about anything that I said or any comments that they would like to make.
Thank you, Rick. That was excellent. So we do have some questions coming in through the chat feature.
Okay, I'll let you read them.
Are you able to see them? Okay.
You know what? Let me see if I can bring my chat up, and if I do that, that'll be easier. Where's my chat function? Oh, there it is. Okay. So were slaves, I guess Janice is asking, were slaves given the right to vote in Jersey from 1776 to 1804? That's a really, really good question. Not from 1776, but after, actually in the late 1700s, in one of our earliest constitutions, don't quote me, but I think it was 1796. It was miswritten, so-called, and women and free, not ever slaves, free Black people were able to vote for a very short period of time. And as soon as women particularly started to flock to the polls, everybody, meaning white men who were in control, got really scared and changed the document, the Constitution, denying this. So no, slaves were never allowed to vote. And it took free Black men a long time as well to get the right to vote. And that's a result of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the federal Constitution. But that's a really deep history that's worth looking into. So thank you for that question. Anyone else have a thought or a comment even? Come on, you're New Jersey people. I know you're curious about this stuff. Anything else, Allison, that you see?
I have a question, Rick.
Sure.
Do you know of any well-known landmarks in New Jersey where there were slaves working on the properties?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question and a very common question for a couple of reasons. There are very few. There are, and I'll get to Kathy's question here in a second. There are several Black cemeteries throughout New Jersey that have markers on them. Over in Camden, which used to be a slave port, believe it or not, as was Perth Amboy on our coast, there are monuments to a slave market in Camden when it was called Cooperstown. I'm part of a committee that is putting up a plaque in June in Eatontown up here to memorialize, of all things, and I hope you're all sitting, the lynching in 1886 of a Black man in Eatontown. A guy named Samuel Johnson, who is referred to as Mingo Jack. And that late date He was lynched by a mob, broke him out of a jail because they thought he had assaulted a white woman. Never tried, killed. And I'm part of another committee group of people that are looking to establish monuments to more positive African-American history throughout New Jersey. So we'll see as that eventuates. So now let me scroll up here to Kathy's question. What is my opinion on reparations for every Black since they are discriminated against? Okay, that's a really, really intricate question. So I think any of us could make a case that the descendants of slaves might deserve and probably do deserve reparation because of what happened to their family as a result of enslavement. When it comes to, let's say, new immigrants from other places in the world that are Black or identify as Black who come into the country, that's a trickier case. Now, I'll just use an example. If somebody comes from Jamaica last year and is working and living and a citizen, it'd be a hard case to make, although they may have Jamaican enslaved ancestries, for the United States, their new country, to give them reparations for something that did not happen here. But I'm no expert on reparations. There's a very timely book, by the way, by a couple of scholars that you can get that may be in the library, and I'll send it. I don't have it here next to my desk, but there's a lot of talk about the various interpretations of reparations. But that one would be pretty tough to decide. If you come from another country, what do we owe you? Now, again, remember, enslaved people were forcibly brought from another country in a lot of cases. So that's a different story. Let's see here. And yes, Kathy, you're right. You do need a lot of resources to prove your descendant. And if you're a Black citizen in this country who believes that you have Black ancestry, you can either contact me via email and I'll give you some hints. But I will tell you that the census records after 1850 start to list Black people by name, not last name all the time, so that makes it a tougher search. But there are records both at the state archives and the state library, and I can send you in some other directions. There are all kinds of genealogical societies that are doing good work. I'll be happy to share that with you. But if you're a Black descendant of enslaved people, I would recommend that you write down all your family stories, capture any documentation you can, and start to work it because it's a growing area of concern. And I can certainly put you in touch with some people that can help. Let's see, somebody else, let me see if I can scroll this. Janice again, I think, says, when were free Blacks not allowed to come into New Jersey? I'm not sure exactly what you mean. You might be referring to the fact that early in, between the period of abolition and the 1804 law in New Jersey for the gradual abolition of slavery, New Jersey slaveholders understood that their slaves were becoming worth less to them in money because they had to free them at one point. They were selling them, and there's plenty of examples, both in my book and that I've seen, where white slaveholders in New Jersey were selling Black people, some of them not even enslaved, to the South because they could get money. The Southern planters were trying to get as many slaves as they could to work their plantations, especially, believe it or not, what were called Jersey slaves, because we had a tradition of agricultural enslavement. And so they could use these people. And so some of these people that were sold into slavery, we hope, especially after 1865, if they had been manumitted, were able to return to New Jersey, but we don't have many records of that. They could have come back on their own, but you have to understand they didn't have the resources, and unless they had friends who could pay for that, it would be very rare. You might want to look up online a story from the New Brunswick area. There's a group of people up there who know about a group of about 130 actually free Black people that were sold into slavery in Louisiana, and who we think, we don't have any records that any of them were able to come back to New Jersey, although it's possible. So that's a very, very hard thing to trace. All of these things are traced as hard to trace, as Kathy mentioned, because records weren't kept to the extent that we see sometimes when Louis Henry Gates does his wonderful show on genealogy on PBS. If you get lucky and can prove it, you are just that, lucky. But because Black people were not seen as worth keeping records about other than numbers and what their value was, the records are minimal, although more and more are showing up every day. So we have hope that that we'll be able to get more of that. But in any event, if your family's involved, please, please, please try to document that so you can hopefully one day take advantage of what might be due you. Am I missing any other chat questions, Allison?
I don't see any other questions, but a lot of compliments. Everyone seems to really enjoyed your presentation.
Well, it's not a enjoyable topic, but I appreciate that. And if you would also, can you send out my email to everyone on the chat so they have it in case they want to contact me about anything? And I don't pretend to be an expert on this because there's just so much data, but I will certainly, if I can, put you in touch with, you'll be surprised, lots and lots of people these days, Black and white, that are researching this topic and are doing really good work to try to get to what I think would be a more equitable society if we can acknowledge our past and how it influences our present. There it is right there, rickg0817@yahoo.com. Allison, I appreciate you putting this group together, and Cassie, thank you for your help today. Thank you for everyone. And do you have anything else, Cassie, that you want to announce about the library?
No, I'll just say that this was really excellent, and thank you so much for presenting for us today.
Okay, terrific. Allison, thanks for putting this together. I know it's not easy all the time, and great job for all of this. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick. You did an excellent job. We really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I thought the turnout for the program was great, which speaks volumes to the interest in this topic. And I found it fascinating, and I really want to thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll see you again soon, I hope.
All right, have a good day, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.